All right, gentlemen, I think it's close enough to 3 o'clock. So with that said, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first episode of Tackle Talk, special Vice Squad edition. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Manchester, Vermont campus of the American Museum of Fly Fishing. Today, I've got the great privilege of being joined by two gentlemen. We've got Jonathan Larrabee, owner of the HMH Vice Company, and HMH Pro Staff, Scott Biron, who is also a museum ambassador. And these gentlemen are here with me today to talk about fly fishing vices, a pretty important tool in the fly tyers arsenal. We're going to start talking a little bit about the history of vices. We'll talk about some of the transitions that have led up to some of the innovations that fly tyers are using today. So with that said, gentlemen, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to start with an image here of a very early fly tying vise. So what's interesting is in terms of the history of the fly vise, the first mention that we're aware of occurred in 1800. And it was in a book by Samuel Taylor. The title was Angling in All Branches from 1800. And this is an excerpt from page 250. And I'm quoting Mr. Taylor. For the better convenience of making these large flies, you should be provided with a very small vise for the purpose of holding the hook, that you may have both hands at liberty to put in your materials, which will enable you to dress the flies more neatly as well as more perfectly. That was in 1800, and it would take approximately 75 years before another vise would find its way into some of the literature in both England and in the States, largely because tyers did not use tools to fashion their flies. In fact, some of the earlier flies were fashioned directly to the hook, which was tied directly to their gut leaders. So utilizing a vise would have been somewhat difficult for them. So it wasn't until approximately 1875 that use of the vise was practiced by more or less amateur tyers. The professionals would tie their flies by hand. That's a practice that some are able to do to this day, but the vise that the tyers use today started out looking something like what you see on the screen. This is an image from J. Harrington Keene's book, Fly Fishing and Fly Making. This particular line drawing appeared in 2 of Mr. Keene's books, but it's a relatively straightforward pair of jaws, a little wing nut tightening screw, and in fact, Scott is going to be tying on a vise that looks very much like this here today. This is a close-up view of the vise that Scott's going to be tying on. And you can see a kind of a diamond-shaped head, very simple C-clamp that was used in constructing these flies. So Scott is going to get started with tying here. I'm going to stop the screen there. There it is. There's Scott, and there's that vise. So as anglers became more accustomed to using vices, there was a bit of a progression. And in fact, John, why don't you show us what kind of evolved from those first basic vices?
Well, from the next, the next series would be more of a little clamp type vise, and trying to make it probably in front of your shirt would be used, a little screw clamp. These came from the watch and clock making industry. If you look very closely here, there's actually a hole down through where a long wire or jewelry smithing would use to hold a wire, but it also could be easily adapted to add a C-clamp to it, so that you could clamp it to the table like what Scott is using and use both hands as mentioned in the previous document. So this was kind of the next evolution towards the turn of the 19th century for a vise to hold a hook.
That's great.
The reason the vices took so long was, like Jim said, there were so many people tying in hand, and they learned from somebody who tied in hand, and it went through that stage. And as we know, with a lot of things, it takes a while to unlearn and change, because you get such a good comfort level with the way you've been taught. And it was all apprentice stuff done in England like that. And it took a while. And then all of a sudden Vises got adopted. And I know my first Vise is right here. This is a screw clamp Vise that came with the tackle tires kit that was my grandfather's camp. And you just screwed it and it tightened it, and it didn't hold the hook very well. And but you learn, this is how you started, and then they've just kind of progressed. Your first Vise was.
It was funny as we were preparing for this, both Scott and I were like, but we have our first Vises. So Scott showed you his first Vise. This was my first Vise. It's the universal Sunrise, and it tied a lot of flies as a kid, and as you said, it didn't hold hooks too terribly well. And as a kid, you're like, yeah, I want to go bigger and better and all that stuff. So you force a big saltwater hook in, and mine, what is called the cam pin here, is now an old roofing nail because it broke at one point, and I replaced it with that. And so it's kind of neat that both of us still have our first Vise that we tied flies on.
And really, there's not a lot of, in terms of the clamp and that sort of thing, the jaws to hold the hooks. We're going to do one more screen share here and show you another design from the early days. That's a Holzapfel Vise. And again, you can see the clamp. There's a little attachment there. John, what would that have been used for?
Well, that probably was more of a material clip, or holding your threads and things like that. It also could be coming from some of the tying in hand as to prepping materials ahead of time and putting them down on a clip or a little knob like that. So that would be a speculation on my part.
Okay. We have the that Vise here. What's interesting is the way that this works. Let me get my other glove on and make sure that we're protecting these items, of course. And the way the jaws would work on this particular Vise, this little slide would naturally fall in place after the jaws grip the hook. And to release, you would simply slide that back up and it would release the hook. So again, you depress it, the slide would fall down and clamp those in. So not a lot of design change from the very, very early days from what we're seeing today. But of course, there's certainly a progression from where we started to where we are today. And I think you have some other examples of some of the more contemporary Vises leading up to HMH.
Yeah, well, certainly, we'll talk the Sunrise that I had. Some of the early Thompson Vises are again the cam lever type Vise that you use a cam lever, it pulls back and closes the jaws to clamp it. And there are two examples here, both from Scott's collection. But then also there were some screw type Vises, and that's where we get into this universal Vise, and that's what a Sunrise, or that's a Herders. That's a Herders, where you'd clamp the hook by twisting a knob back here. And then this also has the adjustability as to you can rotate it once you have the hook clamped. And this was actually a fairly innovative development where, in my Sunrise and the early Thompsons there, you couldn't turn and look at the backside of the hook, especially, doing something like matched wings or eyes. If you're going to put jungle cock eyes onto a streamer or something like that, you'd literally have to like twist the whole unit around if you could do that, or you just shoot blind. So that was one of the innovations that actually HMH came up with, and this is slightly afterwards, but you can see they're all developing about the same time period, because now we're going to transition into some of the early HMH prototypes that are here in the museum. And it's remarkable how similar in form and function the early HMHs are to, you know, to this universal, to that herders, where you had a big wheel to rotate. This would adjust the tension on it. But this is the start of cam levers for clamping. Sort of like the spring tension on that other early vise, but this is using a cam to clamp down on it. And Bill Hunter went further onto the cam idea, where this is one of the earliest vices that Bill made, again having the rotating features like we saw in that universal, but adjustability in the head angle, which is something that, you know, makes it easier to tie on, adjusting the tension, how easy it is to spin. So it's adding some adjustability to it, and his original sketches are part of the collection that the museum has. It's just hard to display them in this environment, but we see how it evolved in his mind. And here we're talking, we know it's after 1972, because that's when he started coming up with the idea of developing a vise. And it isn't until 1976 that we start seeing some of the other more modern vices that we're going to touch upon in just a second. But this is one that, you know, is kind of the evolution of HMH, the evolution of a real production tires vice. Right. And I don't know if you want to touch on that, but you know, Bill, in some of his documentation here, talks about the fact that he had some of these other smaller, lesser vices. We talked about that they didn't really hold hooks very well.
Like the one I'm using right now.
Well,
The gymnastics I'm going through with my hands, I haven't done this for years.
but
No, but what did he say? He had broken 3 vices and he was sick of breaking vices.
Exactly.
And wanted to, yeah.
So he started sketching and coming up with ideas, and we were lucky enough that those documents are here in the museum. And so, you know, as he went through on his development, one of the important people that he talked to and sought information from was a gentleman, Dave Whitlock, and the name we recognize.
Yeah, we do recognize. But if you don't mind, John, before we get into all of that, we talked about the documentation and the history of HMH. So a couple of things I'd like to ask you, in particular, the big question that everyone has a different answer. You can look on the internet, come up with a lot of different answers. What exactly does HMH stand for?
Well, directly from Bill Hunter, HMH stands for Hunter's Madhouse.
Okay.
And when I was talking to Bill the first time, that was the exact same question I asked him. And whether or not the story is 100% true, in that this is what Bill Hunter is telling me.
Okay.
This is the story. When he first came up with one of these early vices, he wanted to take it to a show it around, and in the Dave Whitlock documents, we have the fact that Dave had vice number 1. But his designer, his patent attorney, these vices are labeled patent applied for, said you had to name it something. And so, scurrying around, trying to get ready to go to this show, he called his engraver, or a guy who knew who did some engraving, an Austrian gentleman from the old world, and said, just engrave some name on this. And the guy came back, I think it was a day or 2 later, and was, well, here you go, here are the parts. And Bill unwraps them and looks and goes, what the heck is HMH? Well, at the time, Bill lived in a big farmhouse up on the hill in New Boston, New Hampshire, and people would come and go and buy flies and reels, whatever, right off his kitchen table.
And
and
chew the fat.
and chew the fat and all that stuff. And there were dogs running this way and that, and kids running this way and that. And this Austrian guy in his deep Austrian accent that I'm not even going to try to imitate was like, HMH is this. And Bill's like, what? Hunter's Madhouse. So that's how HMH came to be.
Terrific. And your involvement in HMH, you actually have quite an extensive background that I find fascinating. Would you share a little bit about that? But what brought you to HMH?
Well, how far back do you really want to go? I mean, I started fly fishing when I was 9 and fly tying probably about 10 or 11. And so that got me into the sport. And throughout various growing up, whatever, my parents were antique collectors. So most Sundays we'd go off and go antiquing. And so while they were looking at Chippendale chairs or, you know, silver service, whatever, I was going in the back corners of the barns and the garages and finding bamboo fly rods and playing with those and rebuilding them. And no, nobody needs to cringe. There was nothing too spectacular that I would rebuild and rewind and things like that. But from there, it evolved into, hey, I really like a nice fly reel. And of course, it would have to be a bamboo, you know, antique fly reel to go with my bamboo fly rods and things like that. And so I came across, I think it was one summer we were out at Martha's Vineyard and I was reading F. Kip Farrington's book on tuna fishing around the 1930s. And he kept referring to Vom Hoff. Big Vom Hoff, you know, size 18, size 16, size 20 tuna reels. These just massive things. But then there was some reference as to Vom Hoff fly reels. So I did a little bit of digging and all that stuff. And by now I had obviously gone through high school, gone to college, and I have 2 degrees in engineering, both manufacturing and mechanical engineering. And so I looked it up and I did some patent research and, you know, looked at what it would cost me at Lang's to buy a Vom Hoff fly reel and kind of said, I can never afford one of those. I'm going to build one. So that's how I kind of got into the industry, was building reels.
Okay.
And once you build a size 3/0 salmon reel, you have to go salmon fishing.
Of course.
To go salmon fishing, especially with a 3/0 salmon reel, you have to learn how to go two-handed broadcasting, spay casting. So I took a class at LL Bean to learn how to spay cast and went up and finally caught a grill after 2 trips. Then the next winter was introduced to this gentleman who owned HMH by the guy who had taught me how to fly cast. And I refer to it as the 9 years of courting, but in between my introduction and when I actually bought the majority of HMH, I designed some parts and pieces for him and manufactured them in my shop down in Connecticut when I was living there. And eventually this 9 years of courting, we finally reached an agreement. And in 2015, I bought HMH.
Fantastic.
So that a long story on how I got into the industry and how I, you know, got into fly fishing.
Excellent, excellent. So there's no one better to talk about the history of HMH than these 2 gentlemen. So thank you for that. So you had mentioned a little bit ago some of the influential people that Bill had the good fortune to work with, and the first, of course, was none other than Dave Whitlock. And I'm going to go ahead and quickly give an example. And I should back up just a little bit. One of the other people that he worked with was Polly Rossborough.
Yes.
And in fact, we have an example here at the museum, and as part of the collection, we have what I guess would be the prototype Polly Vise.
Well, it's definitely a very early one. As we, again, we're talking about this presentation, we went through some of the files, the HMH files, and there are the hand sketches of the poly vise and how it was manufactured. And certainly you're seeing the vise that's in the collection. And the fact of the matter is, I didn't remember explicitly until we saw the file, but this actually is it's got an HMH jaw to it. So inside is the HMH jaw about 3.5 inches long, and then a threaded barrel to it. And again, it kind of gathers all these various vices together as to whether it was a spring mechanism, whether it's a screw mechanism, or whether it's a perpendicular screw mechanism or a parallel screw mechanism that all pull down or clamp onto the hook to hold the hook. Remember, our goal here is just to hold the hook.
Hold the hook.
Right? But this, vise that was Polly's, and the early universal we held up earlier that kind of evolved into that first HMH prototype, is kind of the screw mechanism, where this is a big handle that you screw down and it clamps the hook itself. So but yeah, that's an involvement. And the dates on this one we saw was what, 1977, I
Right.
think.
So that was after he had been working on his own designs.
Correct.
So it's interesting that he that Polly reached out to help him with something that he was obviously interested in.
Yeah, and again, our goal here is to hold a fish hook, and whether it's a big hook or and I'm kind of going to transition into the next vise behind there that I think you have a picture of also.
Yeah.
But whether you're going to hold some bigger saltwater hooks, and this brings up a vise that's actually on display behind us over here, but happened to have a sister we didn't know about.
Yeah. So what we have on the screen here is a device that belonged to Lefty Kreh. And the letter that you see alongside the base of this vise was a letter that Lefty had sent back to Bill Hunter. And there's a copy of the letter. And Lefty sent the vice grip vise, if you will, to Bill and said as much, I want you to be able to show people what it's like to use a vice grip versus the fine tools that you're manufacturing. But what's interesting and what I think we're going to see here, Lefty didn't necessarily give up entirely using his vice grip vise. So the vise that you're looking at here is also in the museum collection. It's another vice grip vise that Lefty used. So yeah, he sent one to Bill, which has now come back to the museum as part of our permanent collection. But we also have another vise that came from Lefty's estate. And so Lefty never truly gave up on his vice grip vices.
Well, before you transition from that photo, I think it's very intriguing as to that arm that you're seeing coming off to the, I guess, right. I don't know if it's mirrored on the screen to them, but this tray that really isn't a bobbin rest, but I would call it more of a material tray or something. It's very interesting. It's wide with the two little lips to it. I've never seen anything like it. It's brazed.
Bring it up. I bet he held the tail.
Could be holding the tail feathers
to keep it,
yep.
So he could make it the right length and having them positioned pretty well. And
but it literally is a vice grip that has been welded to a stand rod and
taking an old Thompson A-vise clamp.
Yep, an A-vise clamp. Very similar to the clamp that we see on the other Thompsons. So we kind of touched on it with Polly and touching upon it with Lefty as to some of the production tires had very unique requests.
They were holding a lot of hooks, and
yeah,
you could see just with this, and I could probably use all the early vices that we have in front of us, and this is a 7X hook that was migrating up and down, and I was doing all sorts of things to make sure it wouldn't fall out. If you're a production tire, you need to produce a lot of flies to make it worth your while to sell them. And it really was, you could see these guys had, I gotta hold the hook. Everything else I can do on my own, but if that hook's not held, I can't really, make some money. And then HMH came along, kind of revolutionized everything, because they were the first ones that really took all these other ones that weren't all that great at holding hooks and started to hold the hooks really well.
Right. And again, touching on the individual ones, I think, Jim, you have the picture of what was the transition between in hand and a vise.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
this is a very unique piece that I had never seen one before until this collection came to be.
Yeah,
And-
so here is a note that accompanied those vices. And I'm gonna get that vice out for us.
Oh, I apologize. I thought we had it out, but as he's doing that,
It's just talking in here about it's the first and only HMH hand clamp vise.
Yeah.
With a trout model screw.
And I am going to change this over so people can see exactly what we're talking about here. So we're gonna come back to that in a second.
jump the gun. There we go. All right.
So I'm gonna let you hold that.
This is literally the top part of an HMH a vise. This is, a standard vise chassis, actually mounted backwards, which is kind of neat. And then the cam lever has been welded, brazed to it, this loop. And literally you can sit and hold this in your hand and squeeze it to hold the hook. So you're holding the hook. This is an in-hand fly tying vise. Never seen one like this before. And it's 100% HMH. A, it's referenced in those cards.
Yes.
And B, yep, that's a trout jaw. Yep, that's a standard chassis. And so it's a neat part of the collection that the museum, is lucky to have.
Yes, we are
So-
very fortunate. I'd never seen one of these before, and I was fascinated to learn that you hadn't seen one of these either. So
No, and again, that note doesn't mention who it was made for, but it obviously was made for some individual who still wanted to tie in hand. Just
Or was traveling with.
could have, yeah.
And didn't want to pack up the vise from home and was using that, on the stream and different things like that. So could have been
Yeah.
multiple different things.
So this is a prototype that never went into production. We have some other pieces here that are some pretty early pieces, and I'm going to bring up another screenshot here. I'm going to go back to what we had on screen just a bit ago. This is a vise that was housed in a custom wooden box that Bill referenced in this note, that it was a production prototype for the HMH standard model. And he used that to tie thousands of flies. He talks about the jaws, and he used that particular vise from 1976 all the way to 2003. And while John is holding it up, this is a view of that vise. And I'm going to go ahead and let John show off what is a true prototype design from Bill.
Yep, this is a very early prototype of what I could refer to as the second generation standard vise. And I think that note may reference the fact that we would currently in current production never let a jaw go out that looks like this because there's a big casting flaw in it. But the fact of the matter is, I do exactly the same thing as Bill did, is if I find a casting flaw, that goes into my vise. Because if it's gonna break, I want it to break on my vise, and then I know where we stand, what to tolerate. But out of the thousands and thousands of flies that Bill tied with this vise, that casting flaw is never cracked and never done anything. So that gives you an idea as to some of what Bill did that was innovative. And one of those was to use what's referred to as a high carbon chromium steel for the jaws. And those jaws can now be hardened such that they don't wear. But actually what we try to do is we try to harden the jaws to be ever so slightly softer than most hooks. Reason being is you don't want the vise jaw to bite into the hook, because now the hook's gonna fail. The whole point of this sport is to catch fish.
Right.
So, so that's something that was innovative that Bill did, was he went to a higher quality steel. You know, this being, you know, late 1800s, who knows what type of steel it is. But certainly the Universals and the Thompsons have very soft metal. Great, it will squish down, but then they suddenly burnishes, or then the vise jaws start, you know, doing this, and you can't hold a hook in this gap. So that's some of the evolution of what Bill did with HMH from what we have record of 72 until 76, 75, 76. And we at HMH kind of say, you know, 1975 was the start of what is really the HMH company.
Okay.
And you'll see on our literature since 1975. But we touched upon that one because it was in conjunction with the handheld vise. The earliest vices are actually what you saw earlier with the Dave Whitlock vise, but also this is from the HMH collection, where this is a nickel silver casting, and it's a fixed angle. But this design as to the jaw, the collet we referred to, the chassis, and then the two adjusting knobs. The first brass adjusting knob, and it's exactly kind of the same. This is a modern production HMH vise. These are the ones that we have here at the museum for people to tie hooks on.
Yes.
It's still the same jaw, collet, chassis. Brass knob adjusts how easy it is to rotate the vise while still having the hook in the jaw, so that you could put jungle cock on either side and get it lined up. And then a cam lever, and these cam levers on the early vices I referred to as his patent applied for. This the first series has HMH patent applied for, New Boston, New Hampshire. So we know these are early 70s. The patent was applied for. I don't know if it was withdrawn or if it was denied. There's no record of it in the patent office. I've looked pretty intensely to try to get a copy of it. It also is before really digital format. You know, the patent office is going backwards, scanning things and all that stuff, but they're not going to bother with ones that are denied or withdrawn. So, so that transitions us back to the Whitlock vise. And I'm not going to grab the whole base here, but Dave Whitlock did have HMH serial number 1 to it. And if we bring up the register,
Sure.
the HMH collection here at the museum does have the original log books, and you'll see right there at the top, serial number 1 is Dave Whitlock. And
right there.
I think you're on the page. Yep.
Yep.
But what's interesting, when we looked at this document today, we actually think there might be a second number 1 out there. And the reason being was the only HMH vices that have ever been serialized were the model called the Premium Limited Edition. And this is a standard of the mid-70s. A Premium Limited Edition of the 70s has this big bronze chassis to it. Again, similar knobs.
Let me stop the screen there. Now you can show that up.
Yeah.
So you can see the bronze chassis to it, similar adjusting knobs. The rotation knob has moved forward, the adjusting tension knob. But what it did have was it had the ability to adjust the head angle. The first ones that I mentioned, I guess it's off screen, but it's got a fixed head angle to it. You can't adjust this up and down. This one you can. And that kind of doubles us back to the Lefty Kreh vice grip vices and all that stuff, because on that document that had the premium limited edition serial numbers, serial number 2 replaced the vice grips. And so, but you know, the Dave Whitlock vice, there is HMH serial number 1 floating around of this premium limited edition style. And you know, if somebody has it, I'd love to see it.
I'm gonna bring up and show everyone Dave's vice. There it is. That's the serial number 1.
Standard.
Yep, standard.
Yep.
With that solid chassis. It's a terrific looking vice, and we're very
Weighs
fortunate to
about
have it.
400 pounds.
Oh, the base is very solid. So
Yeah, and
that's yeah, go ahead.
that being said, I mean, it's interesting to look at the Dave Whitlock base here, and it's about an inch thick here. And the next one that I have that came with this vise, and we know is period to this vise, it's only about 3/4 of an inch thick, if not 5/8. So there was a little downsizing or a sense of economy going on here between number 1 and who knows what here. But that is a massive base. So, you know, what I would say is, you know, the evolution of the vice, at least from HMH's side, we haven't changed much. As I kind of outlined with this vice, we've made a little bit bigger chassis to it. The knobs have changed a little bit, and that kind of brings us to kind of the last prototype that we have in the collection here at the museum. And this was designed by Bill Hunter just after he sold the company to API. And this is the vice that if you were starting out and really wanted to, you know, buy the best from API, which was the successor to Bill Hunter, you bought the HMH Spartan or the API Spartan. And Bill designed this for them. I think it was in the early 80s, like 1984 is the date, but you know, don't hold me to that exact date. So everything is still the same function, just scaled down. So this was a great little travel vice or a starter vice. The number of people who come up to me at a show and, oh, I had an API or I had an early HMH when they were back in Maine in the 90s, Spartan vice. This is what kind of replaced or was the next step up from these early Thompsons and things like that.
I'm going to share with everybody some a little bit detailed photo. We're going to back up to the Bill's originally handwritten note about that particular vice. And this, of course, is the vice. Now, you'll notice on the right-hand side, in addition to a spare set of jaws, that there's an interesting clamp mechanism there. And I'm going to swap back to John so he can explain a little about that.
This is a neat, this is the stand rod. So this is the vertical rod that usually, you know, this goes through the clamp. But somehow somebody wanted one where the clamp was integral to it. So this top part slides up and down. The bottom part is threaded. So literally the parts are actually backwards for clamping on a table. So this surface would be inside, but I'm not going to switch it.
Sure.
But so that you would slide that kind of U shape over the edge of the table and then twist the vise and it would climb up and clamp on the table. So it's a neat kind of simplistic design. Whether this was a design concept or whether this was somebody's own individual parts, pieces, whatever. It's a neat minimalist clamp mechanism that might make a nice little travel vice for somebody if I put it into production again.
Aha,
But
great.
neat little thing that is again evolution of HMH.
And to go back to the log,
Yes.
we looked through the log with some 300 and something names in one of the log books, and everybody who was anybody in fly tying, his name is in there.
Oh yeah.
And it's just amazing. You go around and you can see different people who own fly shops that had them, and you know, it was clear that this was a big, like I said before, it was a step up, and they were all ready to jump on board. And you know, it's kind of cool to go back and see who had those vices and whatnot. And if somebody ever finds like the other number one, you know, it'd be really cool to communicate back to us that it's still around
And make it give it
to the museum.
Give it to the museum so it has it's with its sister.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you know, one of the cool things is you know, when I see them, I do pick up the older vices, and we have or can make pretty much any part or piece for any HMH vice. You know, the jaw from this vice that we determined was, you know, 1975 or so, the jaw from this vice that I just removed can interchange with a more modern Magnum jaw just the same.
Right. So I won't embarrass you, but I'll tell the story of how we actually originally met. We knew each other. We were, you know, very friendly to each other and whatnot. But I had been teaching classes for New Hampshire Fish and Game and fly tying, and we had very old HMH vices that were bought from hunters because it was local and whatnot. And John had asked me, he said, "Do you ever try to teach your classes on the HMH vice?" And I said, "You know, we have them, but they don't really hold the hooks very well." And you said, "Can you take a picture of one of those vices and send it to me?" And I said, "Sure." And I took a picture, and you immediately said, "Give them all back to me." And it was, I don't know, 12 or 14 or something like that. And I did give them back to you. And I am teaching on those vices now because you replaced the piece that was faulty, and it was way before you had bought the company, and now we use them and they're great. So it's not one of those, well, it broke and I can't use it anymore type things. It's still, you know, keep it in, and the main part of it is functional, and you just replace the jaw that needed to be replaced.
Well, I think it dates back to that early letter we referenced as to Bill Hunter breaking three vices in 2 years,
right.
As to it's designed for longevity. It's designed for hard fly time.
Right. And I think that point we've made a couple times about production tires and wanting to, you know, they're trying to tie a lot of flies on them, and they can't stand for things that don't work. They have to have that. That's their livelihood. And that's why these vices, kind of the older ones that we still have because we kept them, they just didn't hold up. They couldn't do the production end of it. And everyone was always looking for a better one. You could see the tires that communicated back and forth with Bill because they wanted to we need an upgrade. We need to get it better. And certainly was it's kind of cool to see the whole circle of life here.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's neat that you know, what I tell people who are just getting into fly tying is, you know, buy the, you know, best vice you feel comfortable affording, because you can go out and buy a $20 vice, but you know, you're going to get discouraged with the hook slipping in it, things like that, and then you're going to get discouraged with fly tying. So start out even better, start out on a nice vice with somebody like Scott teaching. So you're getting great instruction, but you're also using a quality product to hold the hooks. And that will determine whether you've got the the patience and the dexterity to do fine work like this.
On an 1880s Vice.
I don't want to tie on that. Yeah. I don't know how many times I tried to see the underside and knew I wasn't going to.
But that was, that was kind of, that still is the basis of HMH. I have young kids who come up and go, wow, geez, these are really expensive. And I say, well, you buy an HMH Spartan Vise, it's the last Vise you will need to buy.
Right.
Whether you want to go finer hooks, you can just unscrew the head. And now I'm getting a little bit into sales pitch here, but you can unscrew the head and you can put a midge jaw in. The same midge jaws that date back to grab it with gloves on, but the same midge jaws that go back to Bill Hunter's original designs. There's nothing finer in the industry to hold a size 32 hook. Now, how big's the 32, Scott?
No.
No.
The magnifying glasses would be just massive.
But you want to do saltwater flies, you took a magnum jaw and you put a magnum jaw in there and you can tie up to size 6 hooks. Big saltwater.
Yeah, you get a good range with, it is the three most important things of a fly tire are the vise, the scissors, and the hooks you tie on. But you can have the greatest materials, but if you don't have those three things, you're in trouble. And you're right, absolutely right. It's like taking someone fishing for the first time, they don't catch a fish, they're probably not going to want to fish again. And if you're tying flies and it doesn't hold the hook, that is often the killer right there. But if you can hold the hook and orientate yourself to fly tying and get to understand the basic construction pieces, it doesn't take much, and then you just cruise.
Off you go.
Yeah, but you can use one of these will meet almost every need of anything that you want to tie out there. It's really unique to buy something that can cover that wide range, which is.
That said, being an engineer, I'm sure that you're always looking to improve or expand without giving away any trade secrets. What are some of the things that you've introduced since acquiring HMH?
Well, certainly HMH always had people asking when we were going to come out with a true rotary vise. Well, I was not too imaginative with the name, but if your customers are asking for a product, you design a product. And I think Scott's gone to get his, but I came out with the TRV Vise back, I think it's about 6 years ago now. And for those who are not totally fluent in the terms here, especially with fly tying, a true rotary vise allows you to put the shank of the hook, which is the long horizontal section here, in line with the axis of rotation. And so what that does is it allows you to hold the material steady and then rotate the hook itself to, Scott likes it really tight.
I like it tight.
With a little bit more adjustment here, I don't know how well people can see it, but the shank of the hook stays pretty steady, doesn't move up and down. Where if we did the same thing with one of these angled vices, if you rotated the hook, it's now going to be sticking up in the air.
Okay.
So that was one of the things that's probably my claim to fame for right now is the true rotary vise. We do have some fairly unique materials coming out. We are the largest supplier of tube fly materials in the United States. Tube flies started really after the war in England when you couldn't get steel hooks, or steel hooks were very valuable, whatever. They started tying on tubes of metal, tubes of plastic eventually. And then you use a very small short shanked hook, and the hook is bare. So all your effort in tying these fancy flies is on the tube. And the hook is ancillary. If the hook gets dinged, if it gets sharp, if it gets, broken, if it gets rusty, it's just a bare hook. All your effort has been put into the fly.
I see.
And what was the benefit they learned was biting a fish on one of these short shanked hooks. It was less aggressive to the fish because it hooked up usually in the corner of the mouth. And also you didn't have this long lever. Think of a crowbar.
Salmon that could lever the hook right out of their mouth.
Exactly, and leave a gaping big hole.
Right.
So that started from the salmon, moved into the steelhead, and is now becoming very popular in saltwater.
Okay.
So we also have manufactured for us scissors, because like Scott said, the vise, the scissors, and the hooks are the three-legged stool you want to make sure your quality flies are tied on. And after that,
Casting and recovery.
Oh, okay.
well,
Yeah.
go into casting for recovery.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So you've become involved in casting for recovery. Tell us about your involvement there.
Well, before I bought the company, we actually had a casting for recovery vise, and the casting for recovery vise has got has a pink chassis and has a pink base. And with every one of those vices sold, we make a donation to casting for recovery.
That's terrific.
And if you're not familiar with casting for recovery, it is ladies who have or are recovering from breast cancer. And what they found was just with anything, getting outside and recreating is good for the mental health as well as the physical health. But when ladies have, surgery on their chest and things like that, casting actually is a good therapeutic thing. And you're the former trainer. Yeah. So not only do we have the casting for recovery vise, but also the first year after I bought HMH, I volunteered as a guide for one of their retreats. And unfortunately, I was not able to do it this past year because my son got married the same weekend. But they have these retreats, up in the Rangeley area of Maine and all. And we have 24 ladies come out and spend the day fly fishing. And learn about what they've gone through and teach them a little bit more about fishing, things like that.
That's fantastic. So if people wanted to go to the website and take a look at some of the casting for recovery vices, they would go to
tyingvice.com. Also HMHvises.com immediately forwards you to tyingvice.com. Another long story, we don't need to go there, but during COVID we had some website issues. We'll leave it at that.
Okay.
And so all the products of HMH are on tyingvice.com. And certainly feel free if there are questions, if you're not computer literate, don't find what you want, the phone number is listed there. And give me a call or shoot me an email at info@HMH Vises.
Wow, that's terrific.
Everything made pretty much in Maine too.
Everything's pretty much made in Maine. Everything is 100% made in the United States. Little things, little screws, and you can't find them made in the United States anymore. But all these castings are made in Maine. All the assembly and all the testing is either done by me or another guide who works for me on the winter. And so it's all right there.
Terrific. Well, I dare say you're probably not going to utilize the design from the 1880s.
I think
introduce something like
I'm
that.
gonna make him about a half dozen of those and make them tie these big shows on.
And I'll come in a week and make it gray.
About as big as my beard, right?
Scott will age exponentially when he starts working on those. Gentlemen, I can't thank you both enough for coming today. I greatly appreciate it. I hope people enjoyed the presentation. Really, we just kind of scratched the surface. I know we covered a lot of territory, and I'm hopeful that you two will come back again for another edition of Vice Squad.
Absolutely. And if anyone has any information that can add to this, they reach out to us, because this is what we've researched. This is what we've learned. And but there's always something around the corner that could add to this information network.
And I know there's another one of the little Spartan prototypes kicking around in a private collection, but go look in your garage and your boxes and your grandfather's stuff. You know, we've got quite a debris field going on in the table here, but there's always more information, always more stuff we can figure out.
That is the best part of my job, is I learn something new every day, and learning that being able to review the logbook and glean that information out of that, and learn that there's, you know, based on the cost of the vise, and looking at the bottom line and looking at the bottom bill total, obviously bill charge for 2 vices, it's recorded in the logbook, so we know there's more than one now.
We learned that today.
And that was only page 1.
Page
line
1, that's right, out of 2 logbooks. So
Yeah.
again, gentlemen, thank you very much. Folks, I would hope that you would come visit the museum here in the Manchester campus. Also visit our campus in Springfield, Missouri at the Wonders of Wildlife Museum. We'd welcome you at both locations. And if you're not a member of the museum, I certainly encourage you to become a member and help support programs such as this. You can get the information at www.amff.org. Again, gentlemen, thank you very
Thanks
much
a
for
lot.
coming today.
Yep.
I had a lot of fun with this. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Have a good evening.